Hello everyone! So in this video we are going to be picking up where we left off last time in Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. Thank you for your patience, and I wanted to say thank you to everyone and for all of your wonderful comments. They were really wonderful and they've all really boosted my confidence and my, I guess, happiness level. So, I have gotten a new camera. I'm actually filming this one with my old camera, but the first video that I'm going to post today, or the other video, I used the new camera. I don't know if I like it, just because of where it focuses. This camera, you can see way more of like my surroundings, and I feel like it's not so close to me, and it doesn't take as much to get it at the level that it needs to be. It's at perfect height right now with just standing on the little camel that I have. Alright, well, enough rambling. I will get to this. There will be a gift reveal on page 231, which is the start of a chapter in here that we're going to get to. And so what I'll do is, as soon as I read the page of the chapter, I'll go ahead and open the gift and then continue. And we are getting very close to the end in this book, so that's great. I hope everyone is still enjoying it. Let me know in the comments. Alright, so we'll be picking up on chapter 22 in this book. And I think we're going to read chapters 22 and 23. At the beginning of chapter 23 is the gift reveal. Okay. Chapter 22. Saucy Jack. Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 1 October 1888. Early morning light slanted in from the cathedral windows of our dining room, but I could stare only at the two pieces of evidence scrawled in Jack the Ripper's hand while my breakfast cooled. The days of holding back his ghastly deeds were apparently over. Jack wanted everyone to know he was responsible for these horrendous crimes. He was like an actor or king soaking up the attention of adoring fans and countrymen. Troubled as I was by Thomas's past, the idea of him being the Ripper didn't sound quite right. The day Thomas Cresswell didn't show off his brilliance was the day I'd find a unicorn for a pet. Jack wanted adoration. Thomas would surely have slipped by now. Then again, he did keep his work with Uncle on transplant secret all these weeks. I cursed my softness toward him. I needed to detach my emotions, but it was proving more difficult than I'd envisioned. I rubbed my temples and read the paper again. I wasn't surprised the serpent side of Mr. Doyle resurfaced. It was only a matter of time before his paper sensationalized this for all the money it was worth. Honestly, Liza whispered, slicing into her breakfast sausage, I wish we weren't leaving so dreadfully early. I've never seen such excitement in the city. Victoria's throwing a masked ball, encouraging boys to come as the Ripper. Tall, dark, and completely anonymous. It's terribly thrilling, wouldn't you agree? I stole a glance at my aunt, who was watching me with a quirked brow. This was a test of good manners. I smiled pleasantly. It certainly is terrible. True, I don't care what people say of those women. No one deserves to be slain like that. You simply must stop whoever it is, Liza started off, then shook herself into the present. I'm going to miss you, cousin. Come and stay with us soon. I smiled, realizing I couldn't wait to see Liza again. My cousin was smart, unabashedly feminine, and comfortable playing by her own version of society's rules. Her clever remarks and cheerful presence would be missed. That would be lovely. I will. I took a sip of Earl Grey, my focus returning to the paper while my aunt and cousin chatted about yesterday's tea I'd missed. Either Blackburn had kept his promise to seek the editor out and run a copy of the Dear Boss letter, or Mr. Doyle has decided to do so himself. I didn't trust Blackburn any more, so my faith lay with the editor releasing the details. I reread the letter, getting lost in the manic cursive for the killer's script, thinking back on the murder case scene. There was an eerie number of similarities. The postcard depicted on the same page was something new, however. As it was dated from the night before, it was clear the murderer only recently posted it. Wretched ideas had assaulted me last night with the growing list of suspects. I didn't know who was responsible, but some memory kept creeping up on me. Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith possibly knew her attackers. Could that be Uncle and Thomas? In Uncle's notes, she told investigators one assailant was a teenager. Uncle was betrothed to her, and clearly it had ended in some manner in which she resorted to prostitution. If Thomas was in on it, it explained how the murders continued while Uncle was in the asylum. It also meant I'd been inadvertently working with Jack the Ripper and possibly falling under his spell myself. My stomach twisted. There had to be something else. I thought of Thornley, recalling the day Thomas and I had learned of Uncle's connection to Miss Emma Elizabeth. Thomas's shock appeared genuine enough. But was it all a farce? Perhaps he was as talented at acting as he was at flipping his emotions on and off. If only my wretched heart could shut itself off from him completely. There was something even worse to consider. My father had connections to most of the victims. It was possible the opium addled his brain in some way, twisting his anguish over mother into something violent. But was my father truly capable of murder? I wanted to deny it, to scream at myself for thinking such an awful thing. But father did have a habit of becoming someone else whenever he was afraid or under the influence of his precious tonic. If father really was innocent, then why did my heart sink at the thought? Then there was the matter of Blackburn. Did he work with father? Their association was hidden from my brother and me for God only knew how long. What else might they be keeping to themselves? The murders began again when father came home. I stopped my mind from wandering down that bleak alleyway. I turned my attention back to the postcard facsimile in the paper. It wasn't very long, but the message was as chilling as the first. The grammar was just as poor, but I had a suspicion it was all for show. The script Jack used was far too clean and careful to be written by someone lacking education. It was a poor attempt at hiding his status in the community. But which status? Doctor, lord, superintendent, or brilliant pupil? I was not coding, dear old... Oh, God. Sorry, it's the stupid scrolly, scripty writing that is so hard for me to read. I was not coding, dear old... lass. When I gave you the tip, you'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event. This time, number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Ha, not the time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. Ooh, mixed with the very the scrolly scripting writing, mixed with the poor grammar, enunciation, and everything. It's very hard to read these letters. I understand that this Jack the Ripper is trying to hide himself in these terrible words, but I wish he would just not, so I could read it. Alright, sorry about that. Moving on. The postcard was written in the same hand as the first letter, the loops too similar to be a coincidence. The front of the offending document held no greater clue than the one before it had. It was addressed to Central News Office, London City. Good morning, Amelia, Liza. I believe your carriage is ready. Oh, good morning, Amelia, Liza. I believe your carriage is ready. Father strode into the dining room with a paper of his own tucked under an arm and concern set upon his face with his attention turned to me. Filling your head with safe and appropriate things? Or are you disobeying my wishes so soon, Audrey Rose? I lifted my face and smiled, an action more kin to a sneer. I was unaware keeping abreast of the daily news was inappropriate. Perhaps I shall spend my time and your money on new corsets to bind my will from my lips, I said sweetly. Wearing something so constricting ought to tether my vocal cords nicely, wouldn't you agree? Father's eyes flashed a warning, but he'd not find me cowering today. I would solve this Ripper case, even if it meant awakening the sleeping beast from within whomever it was resting. The same creature was scratching and howling for a chance to be set free from inside me. I promised it all in due time, placating it for the moment. Well then, Aunt Amelia stood, motioning for Liza to do the same. It's been such a lovely visit. Thank you for hosting us in your absence, dear brother. You must take some time away from town and breathe in our country air again soon. She turned her attention on me, lips pinched in scrutiny. Might do Audrey Rose a world of good, getting away from this madness for a bit. Perhaps you're right. Father opened his arms to his sister, embracing her quickly before she left the room. Liza ran over to where I was still sitting, leaned down, and gathered me into an uncomfortable hug. "You must write to me. I want to hear more about Mr. Thomas Cresswell, and everything regarding the infamous Jack the Ripper. Promise you will." "I promise." "Wonderful." She kissed my cheek, then hugged my father before dashing into the corridor. I was sad to see her go. Father crossed the room and sat in his chair, ignoring me in a way that accentuated his displeasure with my behavior, which suited me fine. After Nathaniel had confessed the truth about our family secret, I could barely look at Father. Mother was dying of scarlet fever, and Father knew of her already weakened heart. He never should have allowed Uncle to operate on her when her immune system was under such attack. He knew Uncle had never been successful before. Though I couldn't blame him for being desperate to save her, I did wonder why he'd waited so long to ask Uncle for help. I'd been under the false impression that Uncle had operated on her before she'd taken a turn for the worse. I let a sigh escape. Uncle should have known better, but how could he turn his brother away, especially when Lord Wadsworth had finally broken down and asked for help? The tragedy of what led us here to this broken shell of a family was overwhelming, and I feared I'd be consumed by grief as Father was if I thought too hard on the past. I received word Uncle was back home late last evening, so I'd stay with him and see what I could discover there. I opened my paper again, not caring what Father had to say about it. "Are you so keen to end up a wretch on the streets?" I took a sip of tea, relishing the bright taste of Earl Grey on my tongue. Father was playing a dangerous game and hadn't a clue. "You'd know a thing or two about wretches on the street." He dropped his hands onto the table, knocking his flatware askew. His face was pale yet angry. "You will respect me in my own home." I stood, revealing all my black riding ensemble. Revealing my all-black riding ensemble. I allowed a full 30 seconds to pass, letting Father take in my mannish attire, shock and disbelief filtering through his expression. I tugged my leather gloves on as violently as I could, then stared down my nose at him. "Those who deserve respect are given it freely. If one must demand such a thing, he'll never truly command it. I am your daughter, not your horse, sir." I stepped closer, enjoying the way Father leaned away from me as if he were just now discovering that a cat, while precious and cute, also had sharp claws. "I'd rather be a lowly wretch on the streets than live in a house full of cages. Do not lecture me on propriety when it's a virtue you so grossly lack." Propriety. "When it's a virtue you so grossly lack." Without waiting for a response, I swept from the room with nothing but the sound of my heels ringing out against the silence. There would be no skirts or bustles to wrangle with any more. I was through with things confining me. Uncle's laboratory was a wreck, much like the man who resided there. Papers were scattered about, tables and chairs upturned, and servants were nervously cleaning on all fours, their attention flitting between their work and Uncle's never-ending tirade. Whether he was upset because his precious work had been tampered with or because he'd come close to being caught for his crimes, I couldn't tell. But I was not leaving here without finding out. I'd never seen him in such a state. Police brought everything back from the evidence chambers when he was released from Bedlam, but threw it back in the laboratory without a care. It seemed Blackbourne was no longer interested in winning my affections. "What miserable fiends!" Another crash reverberated in the small room of the main lab. "Years and years of documentation gone. I've got half a mind to set Scotland Yard ablaze. What sort of animals do they hire?" Thomas entered the room, taking stock of the mess. He righted a chair, then folded himself into it, annoyance scrawled over his features. I studiously ignored him, and he responded in kind. Clearly he was still put off by our argument. Or maybe he felt my suspicion taking form and pointing a finger toward him. Uncle didn't remember much from his time in the asylum. The drugs proved too strong for his mind to battle, or so he claimed. He didn't recall mumbling his name repeatedly or any revelation that might have stepped forth from the darkness. "Don't just sit there," Uncle bellowed, tossing a handful of papers in Thomas's face. Fix this whole bloody mess. I can't function like this." Unable to watch the madness continue, I slowly approached Uncle with my hands up, as if he were a dog driven mad and cornered. I imagined his nerves were frayed as the tonic they'd given him left his body. Uncle's occasional outbursts were never so loud or disorganized. "Perhaps," I motioned around the room, "we should wait upstairs while the maids tend to this." Uncle Jonathan looked ready to quarrel, but I'd Have none of that. My new lack of tolerance extended to all Wadsworth males. Even if he proved innocent of the Ripper murders, Uncle had other things to answer for. I pointed to the door, leaving no room for argument. Maybe it was my new attire, or the stern set to my jaw, but the fight left Uncle rather quickly. He sighed, his shoulders slumping with defeat or relief as he tromped up the stairs. We settled in the drawing-room with cups of tea and pleasant music spilling from a steam-powered machine in the corner. Thomas sat across from me, arms crossed and jaws set. My pulse spiked as his eyes met mine and sent sparks through my body. I longed to yell at him, demanding to know why he kept things from me, but bit my tongue. Now was not the time. Next order of business was more difficult to abridge. There was a river of lies and deceit that needed to be crossed in a short amount of time. I looked at my uncle. He'd been raging and throwing things since I walked in until this very instant. Even now his eyes were slightly glazed over, seeing some wretched thing no one else could. New anger burned quietly under my skin. I hated what Blackburn had done to him. I went to bury my hands in my skirts, then stopped, remembering I had no skirts to hide in. I know what happened with Thomas's mother. Thomas froze, teacup halfway to his lips, eyes wide. I turned my attention to Uncle. The fog surrounding him instantly dissipated, replaced by hardness I'd never really seen in him before. What are you getting at? I met his furious gaze dead on. After she died, you and Thomas began working together, performing secret experiments. Thomas leaned forward, nearly toppling out of his seat, his hawk attention homing in on Uncle's response. If only I could decipher his actions. Uncle laughed incredulously when he saw the seriousness in my face. What does it matter if we did? We haven't performed a surgery in nearly a year. None of this relates to our Ripper. Some ghosts should remain good and buried, niece. And some ghosts come back to haunt us, Uncle, like Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith. Uncle Jonathan's expression was as dark as my father's, and I feared he'd send me away for intruding on his memories. When he sat back, stubbornly crossing his arms over his chest and sealing his lips, Thomas spoke up. I see. You ought to just tell her. You don't see anything, boy, Uncle spat. You'd be wise keeping it that way. I walked across the room and slammed the door shut, shifting their attention to me. If it weren't necessary to this investigation, I'd leave you to your peace, as there's a madman on the loose ripping women apart and potentially trying to use their organs the same way in this room you have done, the way some in this room have done in the past. We do not have that luxury. Technically, we've never tried using organs for anything, Thomas said, then shrugged. My mother was too ill for the procedure. We've tested smaller theories out, but as your uncle said, we haven't performed surgery in a year, and that was simply reattaching a severed finger if you desire the details. And you thought it's a fine idea to hide this from me? We've been a bit preoccupied with hunting down a murderer, Wadsworth, Thomas said flatly. Pardon me for not discussing something I find difficult. Aside from Dr. Wadsworth, and now yourself, I've not spoken of my mother to anyone since she died. Oh. Wait. Especially since my father felt it appropriate to remarry before her body was cool to the touch, and my stepmother cannot be bothered with children who are not her own. I'm sorry, Thomas. He shrugged again and looked away. I sat on a velvet settee. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. This was the reason Thomas was skilled at being emotionally distant, the root of his arrogance. Liza was right. It did cover pain. My heart raced. Part of me wanted to draw him into a hug and heal his wounds, and part of me wished to ferret out all his secrets and piece the puzzle of him together this instant. But there was the matter of Uncle and his connection to Miss Emma Elizabeth that took precedence. With great effort I faced Uncle. I need to know what happened with your former betrothed. I could see the gears working in his mind as he tried to avoid telling me the story. Please, tell me what became of Emma Elizabeth Smith. Uncle tossed his hands in the air. Seems I know less than you. Indulge me, then. Oh, fine. She made me choose, her or science. When I refused, she severed all connections, saying she'd end up penniless before condoning such blasphemous work. Uncle put his head in his hands, clearly thinking of his former love was taking a toll on his already fragile state. A steely determination I was very familiar with seemed to coat his bones then, rejuvenating him within the next breath. After all, this was the man who taught his students how to divorce themselves from the human aspect of something awful and to charge ahead and seek out the facts without emotions blinding them. He sat up straighter, doling out facts one after another. Emma could have carried on with her life, but chose not to. Said she wanted me to hurt as much as possible. Thought it forced me into relenting. He shook his head. Last I'd heard, she'd rented a room in the East End, refusing to take money from her family. Rumors started, as they have a way of doing, that she was selling herself to afford lodging. Uncle removed his glasses and wiped imaginary smudges from them. I couldn't imagine what his emotions must be like. He dropped his hands into his lap. I didn't have the heart to find out if that were true. I pushed her from my mind, getting lost in my work, where I've happily lived out my days the last several years. What happened the night you saw her body? I asked quietly. Does it remind you of the recent killings at all? Uncle jerked his head back, looking startled before twisting his mustache. He took a moment, flipping through the notes of his mind. I suppose she could be one of Ripper's victims. Uncle crushed the leather case he kept his glasses in, his knuckles turning white as bone. When he spoke, it was through gritted teeth. I must return to work. Thomas arched a brow, then set his attention on me. It seemed there were still secrets left to be revealed. I couldn't tell if he was in on them or not, but was determined to find out. Chapter 23. It's on 231, okay. Chapter 23. The Conjurer's Art. Little Ilford Cemetery, London, 8 October 1888. 2 stone dragons stood sentinel over our carriage as it moved across cobblestones and through the largest of 3 ogival archways leading into Little Ilford Cemetery. A heavy mist shrouded a small group of mourners standing around the freshly dug grave of Miss Catherine Eddowes, the slain woman I'd inspected during the double event, blanketing them from the harshness of the day. Winter was biting at autumn's toes, reminding the milder season it'd be here soon. As a sign of respect for the deceased, I'd worn a proper gown instead of a riding habit and breeches I'd recently adopted as my ensemble of choice. My simple black dress was eerily similar to what I'd worn the night of Miss Annie Chapman's murder. I hoped it wasn't a prediction of worse things to come. I felt a strange connection to Catherine, perhaps because I'd kneeled over her body and examined the scene where she'd been found. Papers described her as jolly when sober, singing a tune for anyone who'd listen. The night she was murdered, she'd been drunk, lying in the street before being detained by police until shortly after 1 a.m. Rip found her not long after that, silencing her songs forever. Uncle stayed at his laboratory, speaking with detective inspectors about the second victim of that bloody night, ushering Thomas and me off in the carriage to glean what we could from Miss Catherine's funeral attendees. He believed killers often visited the sites of their destruction or involved themselves in cases, though, like most of his notions, it couldn't be proven. Detective inspectors didn't spend much time convincing Uncle his expertise was essential to solving the case. A little ego stroking on the part of the upper echelons of Scotland Yard went a long way to assuage Uncle's damaged pride. I couldn't stop stealing glances at Thomas, wondering if the very monster I was hunting was standing beside me. Though his story of his mother's death and father's near immediate remarriage tugged at me emotionally, perhaps this was his intention. For now I'd watch him, but act as if all was well between us. Thomas held an umbrella over our heads, his attention focused on everyone in the gathering. There weren't many mourners, and to be honest, none of them appeared to the least bit suspicious, except for one bearded man who tossed stares over his shoulder at us. Something about him set caution humming through my veins. "Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return," the priest quoted from the book of Genesis, holding his arms skyward. "May your soul rest more peacefully than the manner in which you left us, beloved sister." The handful of people murmured a collective amen before dispersing from the plot. Dreary weather kept their sadness at arm's length and their prayers for the dead short. Moments later the sky opened up and rain flowed freely, forcing Thomas to stand a bit closer with the umbrella. Or perhaps he was using it as an excuse. He'd been hovering around me as if I were the sun his universe revolved around ever since he'd let me past one of his many emotional walls, something to ponder another day. I walked over to the makeshift grave marker, kneeling to run my gloved fingertips across the rough wooden cross, feeling a wave of sadness for a woman I didn't even know. The city of London pulled together, giving her a proper burial and grave. People were always providing in death what they would not do in life, it seemed. Audrey rose. Thomas cleared his throat, and I glanced up, spotting the bearded man lingering a few paces off, looking torn between approaching us and fading into the desolate, gray morning. Unable to shake the feeling he had something important to impart to us, I motioned for Thomas to follow me. "If you won't come to us," I said over my shoulder, "we'll bring ourselves to him." I stopped before him, extending my hand. "Good morning. My name is Miss Audrey Rose Wadsworth, daughter of Melina, and what's that?" He asked an invisible person to his left. Thomas and I exchanged baffled looks. Clearly he was unbalanced, speaking to air, but there was something about him knowing my mother's name that unnerved me. He nodded to something we still couldn't see. "Ah, yes, daughter of Melina and Edmund. Your mother says you're welcome to the necklace in the photograph. The heart-shaped locket, I believe. Yes, yes," he said, nodding again. "That's right. The one you admired in your father's study. It's being used as a bookmark of sorts." We'll pause there. We already read page 231. We're actually on page 234. I got a little caught up in it. Yeah, page 231 was the start of the chapter, and I meant to stop there, but sorry. So we'll put a little bookmark here. And this is the item that we're opening in a little tiny box. See? Yay. My camera is doing something weird. Whatever. There's tape. Can't get it off. I'm trying to see what would have been on there. I don't really see much. It's wrapped in a little bit of paper. Cute. They're little dragons. Little tiny dragons. There's a purple one. And like a bluish one. And an orange one. They're really cute. And a green one with his little wings over here. Ooh, little black one. Another purple one, but it's like the Chinese looking kind of dragon. And then there's a white horse with wings. I know she said something about a unicorn, but I don't know. Maybe that one just got mixed in there. But they're dragons! Yay! That's so cute. Because of the dragons that are flanking the little cemetery oval thing. 2 stone dragons stood sentinel. Cute. Very cute. Love it. Okay, so we will continue where we left off. Okay. He paused, squinting at nothing. My heart was very near breaking its way out of my body. Thomas grabbed my arm, steadying me as I swayed on my feet. How could this man possibly know these things? Memories of sneaking into Father's study and looking upon the photograph of Mother assaulted my senses. I'd been admiring that locket, wondering where it was hidden. No one knew about that. I barely even recalled it myself. I took a wavering step back, frightened, yet not quite believing this was not some act of deceit, some illusionist manipulation of the truth. I'd read reports in papers of charlatans and tricksters, unscrupulous fakers making profit by showing audiences what they wanted to believe. There was some kind of smoke and mirrors game being played, and I'd have none of it. "How do you know these things?" I demanded, regaining my composure. Calming my still racing heart, I sought to apply logic to the situation. This man must surely be a skilled liar. He did some form of research, then made educated guesses, essentially the same principle Thomas used while deducting the obvious. Heart-shaped lockets were popular. Practically every woman in London owned one. It was an educated guess, nothing more. For all I knew, the necklace was sitting in a forbidden jewelry box, not being used as an expensive bookmark. I wouldn't be surprised if he worked for some despicable newspaper. Perhaps Mr. Doyle had sent him to spy on us, desperate to ferret out another story. "Easy there, Wadsworth," Thomas said, loud enough for only me to hear. "If you shake any harder, I'm afraid you might take flight, killing us in the process. While I do not fear death, it might prove a bit tedious after a while. All that heavenly singing would become rather grating, don't you agree?" I drew in a slow, steady breath. He was right. Getting agitated wouldn't make the situation better. I allowed myself to calm down before turning my glower back on this liar. He held his hands up, as if he meant no harm, except the harm had already been done. "Let me begin again, Miss Wadsworth. I often forget how odd I must seem to non-seers." He extended his hand, waiting for mine to meet his. Reluctantly, I allowed him to kiss my gloved knuckles, before sticking my hands back at my sides. "My name is Robert James Lees. I am a medium. I communicate with spirits who've passed on. I'm also a spiritualist preacher." "Oh, good." Thomas wiped his brow in a gesture of relief. "And here I thought you were simply insane. This will be much more fun." I fought a smile as the spiritualist stuttered over his next word. Yes, well, all right then. As I was saying, I speak with the dearly departed, and the spirit of Miss Eddowes sought me out almost every night this week, starting from the night she was slain, he said. "My spirit guides told me I'd find someone who could help stop Jack the Ripper once and for all. I kept getting drawn to you, miss. That's when your mother came through." I listened with the practiced ear of a skeptic. My mind was very much immersed in science, not religious fads and notions of speaking with the dead. Mr. Lees exhaled, nodding to that same unforeseen force again. "So I thought. I've got it on good authority you're unbelieving." He held his hand up when I opened my mouth to argue. "It's something I contend with most every day of my life. My path isn't an easy one, but I'll not stop my journey. If you'd like to accompany me to my parlor, I'll do a proper conjuring for you." Part of me wanted to say yes, sensing my wavering. He continued with his sail. "Take what you will from our session, leaving anything which isn't useful behind. All I ask is a few minutes of your time, Miss Wadsworth," he said. "Nothing more. Very best, you walk away with information about the killer, at the very least an entertaining story to share with your friends later." He offered a hard bargain when he put it into those terms. If you have information on Jack the Ripper," Thomas asked, holding the umbrella steady, "why haven't you gone straight to Scotland Yard?" I studied Thomas. His question certainly seemed genuine, unless he was displacing suspicion. Mr. Lees smiled ruefully. "They've declined my services on more than one occasion," he said. "It's easier thinking me mad than seriously regarding any clues I might unearth." I tapped my fingers on my arms, contemplating his offer. The first part about being a good scientist was remaining open to studying all variables, even ones we don't necessarily understand. How little my mind would be if I dismissed the possibility without investigating it, simply because it didn't fit into a preconceived notion. No advances would ever be made. Scotland Yard was foolish to turn him away. There was the considerable chance he was a fraud, but even the tiniest percentage he could be right should be enough to at least listen to him. I knew the hope of speaking with Mother was entering both my thoughts and heart, clouding my judgment. Internally I fought myself. Perhaps one day I'd seek Mr. Lees out when I was ready to confront the emotional mess. Now, with Thomas present, I needed to keep a clear focus. I took a deep breath, knowing this might perfectly well be a giant waste of time, but not caring. If I had to wave chicken feet at every raven I saw during a full moon to stop this murderer and avenge all the women who were tortured, I'd do it. Plus, one way or another, maybe it would remove any lingering doubt I had about Thomas. "Very well, then," I said. "Dazzle us with your conjuring arts, Mr. Lees." Thomas threw an impatient glance at me from across the tiny, battered table in Mr. Lee's seance parlor, his leg bouncing so fast the feather-light table vibrated with his every jitter. The pinched-lipped look I received I returned to him was laced with unspoken threat. I learned something useful from Aunt Amelia after all. Thomas stilled his legs before rapping a jittery beat against his arms. Honestly, he acted as if I were dragging him through the streets across a bed of nails during a winter storm, the mark of a young man with more secrets, or simply a bored one. If Mr. Lees was authentic, I might have an answer shortly. I scanned our surroundings, doing my best to retain an impassive facade, but it was hard. Gray light filtered in through many curtains, lighting on every speck of dust in the small flat, causing my nose to itch. Instruments used for speaking with spirits were jumbled in the corners and poked out of cabinets. The dust covered most every surface. A little house cleaning would go a long way. Perhaps Mr. Lees would have more customers if he tidied up a bit. I supposed, however, one didn't have much time for cleaning when one was speaking with the dead at all hours of the day and night. If his abilities were real, I likened it to being stuck at a party 24 hours a day. The thought of having to listen to someone speak that long was utterly dreadful. My attention snagged on a horn-shaped tube resting atop a rickety looking cabinet. It was one of the few items in the room that appeared shiny and new. "That's a spirit trumpet," Mr. Lee said, jerking his chin toward the contraption. "It amplifies whispers of the spirits. Truthfully, I haven't had any luck with it, but it's all the rage these days. Figured I'd give it a whirl. And that's a spirit slate." The so-called spirit slate was nothing more than two chalkboards tied together with a bit of string. I assumed it was another tool the dead could use for communicating with the living. People wanted to be entertained by gadgets and gimmicks, it seemed, as much as they wanted to speak with their loved ones. A haunted atmosphere was ripe for conversation starters amongst the wealthy who knew nothing of poverty. Thomas coughed a laugh away, drawing my attention to him. He suddenly pointed to my leg, bouncing its own anxious beat against the table, then coughed harder at my dark look. I was glad he was so amused. That made one of us. Right then, Mr. Lees situated himself in the middle. "I'll ask the two of you to place your hands on the table like so." He demonstrated by placing his large palms face down, thumbs touching at their tips. "Spread your fingers apart so your pinky fingers touch your neighbors on either side. Excellent, that's perfect. Now close your eyes and clear your minds." It was a good thing the table was so small, else we'd never be able to reach one another's hands comfortably. Thomas's pinky kept twitching away from mine, so I quietly shifted my foot under the table and gave him a little kick. Before he could retaliate, Mr. Lees closed his eyes, letting loose a deep sigh. "Focus," I scolded myself. If I was going to do this sitting, I'd do it 100%. I ask that my spirit guide step forth, aiding me on this spiritual journey through the afterlife. Anyone with a connection to either Thomas or Audrey Rose may present themselves now. I peeked through slitted lashes. Thomas was being a good sport, sitting with his eyes closed and his back straight as a walking stick. Mr. Lees looked as if he were sleeping while sitting upright. His eyes fluttered beneath his lids, his whiskers and beard twitching to some rhythmic beat only he could hear. I stared at the little lines around his eyes. He couldn't have been more than 40, but looked as if he'd seen as much as someone twice his age. His hair was gray at the edges, receding like the ocean sweeping away from the shore of his forehead. He inhaled deeply, his facial features stilling. "Identify yourself, spirit." I latched my attention onto Thomas again, but he didn't crack a smile or an eyelid, politely playing along with our divining host. He certainly wasn't acting nervous now. I couldn't stop myself from simultaneously hoping and dreading another encounter with my mother so soon. If his opening in the graveyard were to be believed, that was. Mr. Lees nodded. "We welcome you, Miss Eddowes." He paused, giving himself time to think of a fabrication or to listen to the spirit, his face twisted in concentration. Yes, I'll tell her now." "Oh, good. We'll get right into it, then. How silly." He shifted in his chair, never breaking contact with either of our hands. "Miss Eddowes says you were present the day her body was discovered. She claims you were accompanied by a man with pale hair." My breath caught. Hope of hearing from Mother momentarily set aside. Could it be true? Could Miss Catherine Eddowes be speaking through this stout and untidy man? This was all very strange, but I didn't necessarily believe 1 second of it. Anyone who was at the crime scene that morning would have seen me walking with Superintendent Blackburn. Not knowing proper protocol for this type of situation, I whispered, "That's true." I glanced at Thomas, but he was still sitting quietly, eyes shut. His mouth, however, was now pressed into a tight line. I turned my attention back on our spiritualist. "Uh-huh," Mr. Lee said, his tone full of understanding. I wasn't sure if he was addressing me or the supposed spirit hovering about, so I waited with my lips sealed together. "Miss Eddowes says to pass along this message to aid you in believing. She says there's an identifying mark on her body, and you'll know straight away what she's speaking of." The urge to yank my hands back and leave this den of lies plagued me for a few beats. I knew precisely what she was talking about. There was a small tattoo on her left forearm that had the initials TC. That was hardly a secret. Again, anyone could have seen her arm in passing. I sighed, disappointed this turned out to be an act of folly. Before I said a word or broke contact with Thomas or Mr. Lees, he hurriedly continued. "She said Jack was there that day as well, that he'd seen you." He closed his mouth, nodding again as if he were an interpreter passing a message along from a foreign speaker. "He got close to you, even spoke with you. You were angry with him." Mr. Lees rocked in his chair, his eyes closed, moving like confused pigeons squabbling back and forth in front of a park bench. A deep, cold fear wound itself around my limbs, strangling reason from my brain. The only people I'd been angry with were Superintendent Blackburn and my father. Uncle had still been in the asylum, and Thomas and I were not speaking. If this man was truly communicating with the dead, that cleared them of lingering suspicion. But father and Blackburn? Unwilling to hear more, I drew my hand away, but Thomas reached for it, placing it next to his. His encouraging look said we would see through this together, quieting me for another moment. Our medium rocked in his seat, his movements coming faster and sharper. The wood creaked a panicked beat, spurring my own pulse into a chaotic rhythm. Mr. Lee stood so abruptly, the chair he'd been sitting on crashed to the floor. It took several seconds for him to reorient himself, and when his eyes cleared, he stared at me as if I'd transformed into Satan himself. "Mr. Lees, are you going to share what's troubling you with us?" Thomas said, "or are you keeping what the spirit said to yourself?" Mr. Lees trembled, shaking his head to clear away whatever he'd heard and seen. When he finally spoke, his tone was as ominous as his words. "Leave London at once, Miss Wadsworth. I was mistaken. I cannot help you. Go." He bellowed, startling us. He faced Thomas. "You must keep her safe. She's been marked for death." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "If this is some trick, leave! Leave now before it's too late." Mr. Lees ushered us to the door, tossing me my coat as if it were on fire. "Jack craves your blood, Miss Wadsworth. God be with you." Okay, well that got intense. That was the end of chapter 23. We'll pick back up where we left off on chapter 24 in the next video. I hope you're still enjoying it. Sorry for all my mistakes. I kept messing up for some reason. I guess I'm getting out of practice. Maybe I need to read more. Who knows? But that was the end of that. Hope you're still liking it. If you are, leave me a comment below so I know. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you can continue getting more videos. Okay, that's it for now. Until next time, reading my read. Bye!